The early morning sun filtered through the canopy of evergreens, its golden beams piercing the mist that clung stubbornly to the forest floor. Maggie Carter tugged her tattered shawl closer around her thin frame as she stepped out of the rickety cabin she called home. The air was crisp, the kind that stung her cheeks and filled her lungs with a biting freshness. She welcomed it, though. This was her life, and she had grown to love the stillness of the woods, even as it reminded her of all they lacked. The cabin behind her creaked softly as the wind teased its worn wooden walls. It was a simple structure, barely large enough for the two of them. Inside, her mother, Linda Carter, lay on a small bed near the hearth, her frail body cocooned in thin blankets. The persistent cough and fever that plagued her had worsened over the winter. Now spring had arrived, but the promise of warmth and abundance seemed a cruel joke for the Carters. Maggie glanced back toward the cabin, hesitating for a moment before venturing further into the forest. The foraging basket in her hand was nearly empty. Half a loaf of stale bread and a few wrinkled potatoes were all they had left to stave off hunger. The weight of responsibility pressed on her shoulders as it did every day, but she bore it with quiet resilience. Her mother depended on her, and Maggie had no intention of letting her down. The forest was alive with its usual symphony, the chirping of unseen birds, the rustling of leaves as squirrels darted among the branches. Maggie moved carefully, her eyes scanning the ground for anything edible. Wild onions, mushrooms, berries. She paused now and then to listen, her senses attuned to the subtle rhythms of the wilderness. She remembered her father's words, spoken in a voice that now echoed only in her memories. The forest gives, but it can also take away. Respect it, and it'll keep you alive. Her father had been their rock, the one who taught her to set traps, recognize edible plants, and protect herself in a world that was often unkind. He was gone now, taken by a storm that had claimed both their boat and the little they owned. Maggie froze mid-step as a faint sound reached her ears, something out of place. It was distant but unmistakable, a cry for help. Her pulse quickened as she strained to listen. The cry came again, louder this time, tinged with desperation. Her first instinct was to turn back. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, warning her of the dangers that lurked in the forest. Wild animals, poachers, strangers who could not be trusted. But the sound pulled at her heart, igniting a flame of curiosity and concern she couldn't ignore. Gripping the small hunting knife she carried for protection, Maggie made her way toward the sound, her steps cautious yet deliberate. The cries grew louder, guiding her deeper into the woods. Her breath caught as she stepped into a clearing and saw the source of the noise. A man lay slumped against a tree, his leg caught in the cruel jaws of a rusted bear trap. Blood stained his trousers and pooled on the forest floor. The metallic scent mingling with the earthy aroma of pine and moss. His face was pale, streaked with sweat and dirt, and his chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. Maggie stared, frozen for a moment by the sheer gravity of the scene. The man's eyes flickered open, locking onto hers. "Help me," he rasped, his voice barely audible. Her heart thundered in her chest as she took a step closer, her fingers tightening around the knife. Every instinct told her to turn and run, to leave this stranger to his fate. But something deeper, something stronger, urged her to stay. The man groaned, his hand twitching weakly toward the trap. Maggie swallowed hard, steeling herself as she knelt beside him. Up close, she could see the jagged teeth of the trap, biting into his leg, the torn fabric of his expensive trousers, revealing raw, mangled flesh beneath. "This is going to hurt," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if he was coherent enough to hear her. Taking a deep breath, she gripped the trap with both hands and pulled with all her strength. The rusted metal refused to budge at first, its edges biting into her palms. The man cried out in agony, and she paused, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "You can do this, Maggie," she muttered to herself, channeling her father's voice. She adjusted her grip, braced her foot against a root for leverage, and heaved with everything she had. The trap groaned and finally sprang open, releasing its hold on the man's leg. He slumped forward with a pained gasp, his body trembling from the effort. "Can you stand?" Maggie asked, her voice firm despite the fear bubbling in her chest. The man shook his head weakly, his eyes fluttering shut. She bit her lip, her mind racing. She couldn't leave him here. Not like this. But dragging him all the way back to the cabin was a daunting task. She tore a strip of fabric from her underskirt and tied it tightly around his leg to slow the bleeding. "Stay with me," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Then, with a strength born of necessity, she hooked her arms under his shoulders and began the arduous journey back to the cabin. By the time Maggie stumbled through the cabin door, her body was screaming in protest. The man was barely conscious, his head lolling against her shoulder. Linda gasped from her bed, her eyes wide with shock. "Maggie, what have you done?" she whispered. Maggie lowered the man onto the floor near the hearth, collapsing beside him. "I found him in the woods," she panted. "He's hurt, Mama. I couldn't just leave him." Linda's gaze flickered between her daughter and the stranger, fear and concern warring in her expression. "We don't know who he is. We don't know what he'll bring into our lives." Maggie met her mother's eyes, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "He needed me, Mama, and I couldn't let him die." The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the cabin's worn walls. Outside, the forest was dark and still, as if holding its breath. Maggie sat by the stranger's side, watching his shallow breaths and wondering what fate had led her to this moment. Was this the beginning of hope, or the start of danger? The air in the cabin was heavy with tension. The stranger lay unconscious near the hearth, his labored breaths filling the silence. Maggie sat cross-legged beside him, her hands still trembling from the effort of dragging him through the forest. Blood seeped through the makeshift bandage on his leg, a stark reminder of how close he had been to death. Her mother's voice broke the silence, low and firm. "Maggie, you shouldn't have brought him here." Maggie turned to Linda, her eyes filled with quiet determination. "I couldn't leave him, Mama. He was dying." Linda sighed, coughing weakly into her hand. "We don't know who he is, what he's done. Bringing a stranger into our home could put us both in danger." Maggie's gaze didn't waver. "I know, but he's hurt, and I couldn't just walk away. What if it were me lying out there? Wouldn't you want someone to help?" Linda's expression softened, but her worry remained evident. She sank back against her pillow, her frail frame illuminated by the flickering firelight. "Be careful, Maggie. Kindness can be a dangerous thing." As the hours passed, the stranger began to stir. Maggie kept a close watch on him, her knife within reach, just in case. His eyelids fluttered, and he let out a low groan, his face contorted in pain. "You're safe," Maggie said softly, leaning closer. "But you need to stay still." The man's eyes opened, unfocused and glassy. "Where?" he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're in my cabin," Maggie replied. "I found you in the forest. You were caught in a trap." He winced, his hand twitching toward his injured leg. "The trap?" "I got it off you," Maggie interrupted. "But your leg is bad. You'll need more than what I can do here." The man turned his head slightly, his gaze locking onto hers. His pale blue eyes were sharp, despite the fever burning through him. Why? Why did you help me? Maggie hesitated, caught off guard by the question. Because you needed me, she said simply. And I couldn't let you die. He stared at her for a long moment, before his head fell back against the makeshift pillow. You're braver than most, he murmured, his voice fading as unconsciousness claimed him once more. The next morning, Maggie woke to the sound of the man groaning in his sleep. She moved quickly, checking the bandage on his leg. The wound was swollen and red, the edges angry with infection. Her heart sank. She had done all she could, but it wasn't enough. I have to get help, she said aloud, more to herself than to anyone else. Linda stirred in her bed, her voice faint. Maggie, no. The forest, it's too dangerous. I don't have a choice, Mama, Maggie replied, gathering supplies into her worn satchel. If I don't go, he won't make it. Linda's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Promise me you'll be careful. Maggie nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. I promise. The forest felt different today, darker enough and more foreboding. Maggie moved swiftly but cautiously, her knife tucked into her belt and her satchel slung over one shoulder. The path to the nearest town was treacherous. She knew it well, from the few times her father had taken her along. As she walked, her thoughts drifted to the man she had left behind. Who was he? His clothing, though torn and blood-stained, had been expensive. The gold watch on his wrist, and the way he carried himself, even in pain, hinted at a life far removed from her own. A sudden rustle in the underbrush snapped her attention back to the present. She froze, her heart pounding. Slowly she reached for her knife, her eyes scanning the shadows. A low growl echoed through the trees. The wolves emerged from the underbrush, their golden eyes glinting in the dappled sunlight. Maggie's grip tightened on the knife as she backed away slowly, her breath quickening. There were 3 of them, large, sleek, and hungry. She knew better than to run. Running would make her prey. One of the wolves stepped closer, its ears pinned back and its teeth bared. Maggie swallowed hard, her mind racing. Oh, she needed a plan. Fast. A sudden shout shattered the tension. Get back! Maggie turned to see a man standing a few yards away, a rifle in his hands. He fired a warning shot into the air, and the wolves scattered, their sleek forms disappearing into the trees. You all right? The man asked, lowering his rifle as he approached. He was tall and weathered, with a thick beard and sharp green eyes. His clothing was rugged, his boots caked with mud. I think so, Maggie managed, still clutching her knife. The man studied her for a moment before nodding. Name's Ben Turner. You shouldn't be out here alone, kid. These woods aren't as safe as they used to be. I didn't have a choice, Maggie replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her. I'm trying to get to town. Ben raised an eyebrow. Town's a long way from here. What's so urgent? Maggie hesitated, debating how much to reveal. Finally, she said, There's a man back at my cabin. He's hurt bad. I need to find help. Ben's expression softened. All right, I'll help you get to the edge of the forest. But you're on your own after that. Thank you, Maggie said, her relief evident. With Ben's guidance, Maggie navigated the forest more quickly, avoiding traps and hidden dangers. He shared stories as they walked, tales of his own encounters with the wild, and the lessons he'd learned along the way. You remind me of my daughter, he said at one point, his tone wistful. She was brave, like you. What happened to her? Maggie asked softly. Ben's expression darkened, and he didn't answer. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, the sky had turned a threatening shade of gray. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to fall. This is as far as I go, Ben said, handing her a small bundle. Take this. It's dried meat and a little water. You'll need it. Thank you, Maggie said, tucking the bundle into her satchel. For everything? Ben tipped his hat. Good luck, kid. As Maggie stepped onto the dirt road leading to town, the storm broke in earnest. Rain lashed at her face, and the wind howled. But she pressed on, her determination unwavering. Somewhere behind her, in the safety of the cabin, a man's life hung in the balance, and somewhere ahead, in the sprawling town, lay the hope of saving him. And perhaps her mother, too. The storm raged, but Maggie's resolve burned brighter. This was a journey she couldn't afford to fail. The cabin was eerily quiet as Maggie pushed the heavy door open, her body drenched from the storm that had pursued her back from the forest's edge. She dropped her soaked satchel by the door, her limbs trembling with exhaustion. Ethan lay where she had left him, near the hearth, his pale face shining with sweat. His chest rose and fell unevenly, each breath a battle. Maggie's mother, Linda, sat nearby, her frail hands twisting a corner of her blanket as she watched the stranger with wary eyes. You're back, Linda said, her voice thin but steady. Did you find help? Maggie shook her head, brushing the rainwater from her face. The town is still too far, and the storm's gotten worse. But I met someone in the forest, a hunter named Ben Turner. He helped me get through the worst of it. Linda's eyes narrowed. And this Ben Turner, can he help us now? Maggie sighed, sinking into a chair. He said he doesn't come this far out. I have to make it to town tomorrow. Her mother's gaze drifted to Ethan. Tomorrow might be too late for him. Linda's skepticism of Ethan deepened as the hours wore on. She rarely took her eyes off him, her instincts honed by years of hardship. To her, every stranger was a potential threat, a lesson learned through painful experience. He's been muttering in his sleep, Linda said, her voice low. Something about money and regrets. Maggie glanced at Ethan, who shifted slightly on the makeshift bed. His fever had yet to break, and his wounds were still red and swollen. He's delirious, she said. It doesn't mean anything. It might mean everything, Linda replied. We don't know who he is or what he's done. Bringing him here could put us in danger. Maggie met her mother's gaze, her own filled with quiet defiance. If we don't help him, he'll die. And if that happens, we're no better than the world that turned its back on us. Linda's expression softened, but her worry didn't fade. She reached out and took Maggie's hand, her grip surprisingly firm. You have a kind heart, Maggie. But kindness can cost more than you're willing to pay. As the storm continued to rage outside, Maggie worked tirelessly to care for Ethan. She changed his bandages, her fingers trembling, as she cleaned the wound with what little clean water they had left. Each groan of pain from Ethan sent a pang through her chest, but she pressed on, her resolve unwavering. When she wasn't tending to Ethan, Maggie sat by the fire, stitching the tear in his coat. The fabric was fine, too fine for someone who belonged in a forest trap. She turned the coat over in her hands, her fingers brushing against the embroidered initials on the inside pocket. E.W. Who are you? She murmured under her breath. Ethan stirred, his eyes fluttering open. His voice was hoarse, barely audible. Water. Maggie hurried to his side, holding a small cup to his lips. He drank slowly, wincing with every swallow. When he finished, his eyes met hers, clearer now, but still filled with pain. You saved me, he said, his voice rasping. Why? Maggie hesitated, then said simply, because you needed me. Ethan's lips curved into a faint, incredulous smile. Not many would have. Well, I'm not many, Maggie replied, her tone light, but her expression serious. And you're lucky for that. As the days passed, Ethan grew stronger, though his leg remained a source of constant pain. Linda continued to watch him warily, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Ethan, for his part, seemed to sense her distrust and kept his interactions with her minimal. One evening, as the fire crackled softly, Ethan spoke. "I owe you both my life." Linda looked up from her chair, her expression unreadable. "Gratitude doesn't always pay the bills." Ethan flinched, a flicker of shame crossing his face. "I'll repay you," he said. "Whatever it takes." "How?" Linda pressed. "You can't even walk." Maggie shot her mother a reproachful look. "Mama." "No, she's right," Ethan said, his tone somber. "But I can fix this. I have resources, money, connections. If you help me get back to my family, I can make sure you're taken care of." Linda's skepticism deepened. "And why should we believe you?" Ethan met her gaze, his pale blue eyes steady. "Because I don't have anything else to offer." Later that night, Maggie sat beside Ethan, her curiosity getting the better of her. "You said you have money," she began hesitantly. "What do you do?" Ethan's expression darkened. "I used to run a company. Big, successful, until it wasn't." "What happened?" He hesitated, then said quietly, "I made mistakes. Trusted the wrong people. Lost everything that mattered." Maggie studied him, her brow furrowing. "If you lost everything, why does it sound like you're still holding on to something?" Ethan chuckled, though the sound held no humor. "Because I'm stubborn, and because some part of me still hopes I can fix it." As the storm began to wane, Ethan called Maggie over to his side. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice stronger now, "you need to go to town." Maggie nodded. "I'll leave at first light." Ethan reached for the inside pocket of his coat, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "Take this," he said, handing it to her. "It has my family's address. Give it to them, and they'll know what to do." Maggie took the paper, her fingers brushing against his. "I'll do my best." Ethan's gaze softened. "I believe you." As Maggie tucked the paper into her satchel, Linda's voice cut through the quiet. "Be careful out there, Maggie." Maggie turned to her mother, her resolve evident. "I will, Mama." But as she lay down that night, staring at the shadows dancing on the cabin ceiling, a gnawing sense of unease crept over her. The forest was dangerous, yes, but the world beyond it felt even more so. And she had just promised to face it alone. The first light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the cabin's wooden walls, casting faint golden streaks across the floor. Maggie stirred on her makeshift bed by the fire, her heart already heavy with the weight of the day ahead. Today, she would venture into the forest again, but this time, her path would take her farther than she had ever gone before. "Maggie," her mother's voice called softly from the corner of the room. "Come here." Maggie rose, brushing the sleep from her eyes. Her mother sat upright in bed, her frail hands gripping the worn quilt draped over her lap. Despite her pale complexion, Linda's gaze was sharp, filled with both worry and determination. "Are you sure about this?" Linda asked, her voice trembling slightly. "The forest isn't forgiving. And beyond it, who knows what awaits?" Maggie knelt by her mother's side, taking her hand gently. "I have to do this, Mama. If there's even a chance he can help us, help you, I can't ignore it." Linda searched her daughter's face, then nodded reluctantly. "Promise me you'll be careful." "I promise." Maggie rose and gathered her things, slipping Ethan's folded note into the inner pocket of her jacket. She packed a small satchel with the few provisions they had left, a slice of bread, a handful of dried berries, and a canteen of water. As she laced up her worn boots, Ethan stirred from his spot by the fire. "Leaving already?" he rasped, his voice still rough from the fever. Maggie nodded. The sooner I leave, the sooner I'll get back. Ethan's gaze met hers, and for a moment, his expression softened. You're braver than most, he said quietly. Thank you. The forest was still damp from the previous night's storm, the scent of wet earth and pine needles filling the crisp morning air. Maggie adjusted the strap of her satchel and tightened her grip on the small hunting knife at her waist. The path ahead was overgrown and unfamiliar, but she pressed on, determined to reach the town before nightfall. The forest felt different today, quieter, heavier, as if the storm had left behind more than just rain-soaked branches and puddles. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, set her heart racing. She whispered a silent prayer as she moved, her eyes scanning the ground for signs of danger. By mid-morning, Maggie reached the swollen river that cut through the heart of the forest. Normally, this crossing was manageable, with a series of stepping stones leading from one bank to the other. But the storm had transformed the gentle current into a roaring torrent, the stones submerged beneath the churning water. Maggie's breath hitched as she studied the river. Turning back wasn't an option, and waiting for the water to subside would take days, time they didn't have. She spotted a fallen tree lying across the river, a short distance upstream. Its thick trunk was slick with moss and rainwater, but it seemed sturdy enough. Carefully, Maggie climbed onto the log, her arms outstretched for balance. The roar of the water below made her head spin, but she kept her focus on the opposite bank. Step by step, she inched her way across, her boots slipping slightly with each movement. About halfway across, a gust of wind rattled the trees, causing the log to wobble. Maggie froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and forced herself to keep moving. Finally, her boots touched solid ground, and she let out a shaky sigh of relief. As Maggie continued through the forest, the shadows grew longer, the sunlight fading behind a canopy of dense branches. The sound of rustling leaves made her pause, her grip tightening on her knife. At first she thought it was just the wind, but then she saw them, golden eyes glinting in the underbrush. A pack of wolves emerged from the shadows, their sleek gray bodies moving silently through the ferns. Maggie's pulse quickened as she slowly backed away, her knife trembling in her hand. The lead wolf, larger than the others, stepped forward, its sharp teeth bared in a low growl. "Stay back," Maggie whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. The wolves didn't retreat. Instead, they began to circle her, their movements deliberate and predatory. Maggie's mind raced, searching for a way out. She remembered the hunter, Ben Turner, and his warning about wolves this far into the forest. "They're hungry," he had said. "Desperate." Maggie's foot brushed against a fallen branch, and she quickly scooped it up, waving it in front of her to keep the wolves at bay. "Go on," she shouted, her voice shaking. "Get out of here." The wolves hesitated, their golden eyes watching her every move. Then, a sharp whistle pierced the air, cutting through the tension like a knife. The wolves froze, their ears twitching, before slinking back into the shadows. Maggie turned toward the source of the whistle and saw a man stepping out from behind a tree. He was tall and weathered, with a rifle slung over his shoulder and a wide-brimmed hat, casting a shadow over his face. "Looks like you could use a hand," the man said, his voice calm and steady. The man introduced himself as Ben Turner, a reclusive hunter who roamed the forest's edges. He led Maggie to a small clearing, where he had set up camp, offering her a chance to rest and regroup. "You're a brave one, wandering this deep into the woods," Ben said, as he handed her a tin cup filled with steaming tea. "But brave doesn't always mean smart." Maggie bristled at his tone. I didn't have a choice. Ben raised an eyebrow. No one comes out here without a choice. So what's yours? Maggie hesitated, then told him about Ethan and her mother, about the cabin, and the desperate journey to the town. Ben listened silently, his expression unreadable. You've got guts, he said finally. But the forest doesn't care about guts. It'll chew you up and spit you out if you're not careful. Maggie squared her shoulders. I've made it this far. I can make it the rest of the way. Ben chuckled, a low, gruff sound. You remind me of someone I used to know. Stubborn as a mule, but with a heart that won't quit. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small leather pouch. Take this. It's not much, but it might help. Maggie opened the pouch to find a handful of dried meat and a small flint. She looked up at Ben, her gratitude evident. Thank you. By the time Maggie reached the edge of the forest, the sky had turned a bruised shade of gray and the first drops of rain began to fall. The town lay ahead, its rooftops barely visible through the mist. But as she stepped out of the trees, a loud crack of thunder echoed behind her, and the storm rolled in once more. Maggie tightened her grip on her satchel and pressed forward, her resolve unshaken. She had made it this far, and she wasn't about to turn back now. But deep in her heart, she couldn't shake the feeling that her journey was only just beginning. The town of Ashmore was nothing like Maggie had imagined. The cobblestone streets bustled with life. Carriages clattered noisily over uneven stones, and shopkeepers called out to passers-by from colorful stalls. For a girl who had spent most of her life in the isolation of the forest, the sights, sounds, and smells were overwhelming. Maggie clutched her satchel tightly, her knuckles white as she navigated through the crowd. She kept Ethan's note tucked safely in her jacket pocket. The name and address, scrawled in his shaky handwriting, etched in her memory. Whitmore Estate. Excuse me, Maggie asked a man unloading crates from a wagon. Do you know how to get to the Whitmore Estate? The man stopped, wiping sweat from his brow. His eyes narrowed as he looked her over, taking in her mud-streaked boots and patched jacket. Whitmore Estate, eh? Fancy place, up on the hill. What business do you have there? I need to deliver something important, Maggie stammered. The man shrugged, pointing toward the northern edge of town. Follow the main road till you see the gates. Can't miss it. Maggie nodded her thanks and hurried away, ignoring the curious stares that followed her. The thought of turning back crossed her mind more than once, but the image of her mother's pale face and Ethan's pained expression pushed her forward. The Whitmore Estate was a world away from the modest cabins and simple shops of Ashmore. As Maggie approached, the wrought iron gates loomed high above her, the intricate designs twisting and curling like vines. Beyond the gates lay a long gravel driveway, lined with towering oak trees, their branches forming a canopy that stretched toward a sprawling mansion in the distance. Maggie hesitated, her heart pounding. The mansion was unlike anything she'd ever seen, its tall windows glinting in the sunlight, and its stone facade pristine and imposing. It was a far cry from the humble cabin she called home. Summoning her courage, Maggie reached for the brass knocker, shaped like a lion's head. The heavy thud echoed ominously as it struck the gate. Moments later, a man in a crisp black suit appeared. His posture was stiff, his gaze sharp and assessing. Yes? He asked, his tone clipped. I'm here to see someone, Maggie said, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan Whitmore. He's hurt, and he sent me with this. She fumbled with her pocket, pulling out the folded note. The man's eyes flicked to it, before narrowing at her disheveled appearance. Mr. Whitmore isn't accepting visitors, he said curtly, beginning to close the gate. Wait, Maggie exclaimed, her voice rising with desperation. He's in trouble. He's hurt, and he told me to come here. Please, just look at the note." The man paused, his expression unreadable. Finally, he opened the gate, just wide enough to take the paper from her outstretched hand. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the contents quickly. His brows furrowed, and without another word, he gestured for Maggie to follow him. The grandeur of the estate only deepened as Maggie stepped inside. Marble floors gleamed under the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, and the walls were adorned with paintings larger than any she had ever seen. Every detail, from the carved banisters to the ornate rugs, spoke of wealth and refinement. "Wait here," the man instructed, leading her into a sitting room, filled with plush furniture and a crackling fireplace. Maggie perched nervously on the edge of an armchair, her fingers gripping the hem of her jacket. She felt out of place, her forest-worn clothes and mud-caked boots, a stark contrast to the elegance surrounding her. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours before the door opened again. This time, a woman entered, a tall, striking figure in a tailored dress that exuded authority. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her piercing blue eyes locked onto Maggie with an intensity that made her stomach twist. "I'm Charlotte Whitmore," the woman announced, her tone cool and measured. "And you are?" "Maggie Carter," she replied, standing quickly. "I found Ethan in the forest. He's hurt bad. He asked me to come here." Charlotte's eyes narrowed. "You expect me to believe that my brother, a man of considerable means, is lying injured in some God-forsaken forest, and you, a stranger, just happened to find him?" "It's the truth," Maggie said, her voice firm. Despite her growing unease, "I couldn't just leave him there. He's alive because I brought him back to my cabin." Charlotte's lips pressed into a thin line, and she turned to the man who had brought Maggie inside. "James, fetch Lawson." James left and returned moments later with a man in his early 40s. He had a kind face, with soft eyes and an air of quiet competence. This was James Lawson, Ethan's personal assistant, and the moment he saw the note, his expression changed. "This is Ethan's handwriting," Lawson confirmed, looking up at Charlotte. "And this address, he wouldn't have written it unless it was serious." Charlotte crossed her arms, skepticism etched into every line of her face. "Even if it is, how do we know she isn't taking advantage of the situation?" Maggie bristled. "I don't want anything from you. I just want to help him, and my mother." Lawson stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Charlotte, if Ethan is in danger, we need to act quickly. If this girl is telling the truth, we don't have time for doubts." Charlotte hesitated, then sighed sharply. "Fine. Prepare the helicopter." As the staff prepared for the rescue mission, Maggie caught snippets of heated conversations between Charlotte and Lawson. It was clear that the Whitmore family was no stranger to conflict. "He's always been reckless," Charlotte said bitterly, "running off on these ridiculous adventures, throwing money at pointless causes. And now, look where it's gotten him." "Ethan's philanthropy isn't pointless," Lawson countered. It's helped countless people. You just refuse to see it." Maggie watched the exchange quietly, sensing that there was more to the family's discord than they let on. Charlotte's icy demeanor and Lawson's staunch defense of Ethan painted a picture of a household divided. The roar of the helicopter's blades filled the air as it prepared to take off. Maggie stood by the edge of the helipad, her hair whipping in the wind as she clutched her satchel tightly. Charlotte approached her, her expression unreadable. "If you're lying about any of this," she said coldly, "you'll regret it." "I'm not," Maggie replied, meeting her gaze without flinching. "You'll see." As the helicopter rose into the sky, Maggie's thoughts turned to Ethan and her mother. The journey back to the cabin would be perilous, but the hope of saving them both gave her the strength to push forward. The helicopter blades whirred above as the sleek black craft cut through the overcast skies. Maggie sat tensely beside James Lawson, her hands gripping the edge of the seat. The closer they got to her cabin, the tighter her chest felt. She had brought hope with her, but would it arrive in time? James leaned closer, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. "We'll get there soon, Maggie. You've done your part. Let us handle the rest." Maggie nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the dense forest below. The vast green expanse stretched endlessly, concealing both danger and the small haven she called home. Somewhere down there, her mother and Ethan were clinging to life. The helicopter began its descent as the pilot found a clearing near the cabin. The noise of the rotor blades sent birds scattering from the trees, their cries echoing in the stillness of the forest. As the rescuers disembarked, Maggie's feet hit the ground running. She led the team through the overgrown path, her breaths coming fast and shallow. The forest seemed darker than she remembered, the weight of her mission pressing down on her shoulders. Behind her, James called out, "Slow down. We don't want to lose you." "I know the way," Maggie shot back, not breaking her stride. The cabin came into view, its crooked frame standing as a fragile beacon against the sea of trees. Smoke still curled faintly from the chimney, a sign that life remained inside. Maggie burst through the cabin door, her heart pounding. Her mother, Linda, was slumped in the chair by the fire, her face pale and damp with sweat. Ethan lay on the bed, his bandaged legs stretched out awkwardly. His breathing was shallow, and his complexion had turned ashen. "Mama!" Maggie rushed to her mother's side, taking her frail hand. "Help is here. They're going to take care of you." Linda stirred weakly, her eyelids fluttering open. "Maggie, you're back." Her voice was barely above a whisper. The medical team moved swiftly. One paramedic began checking Linda's vitals, while another knelt by Ethan's side, assessing his condition. Maggie hovered nearby, her eyes darting between the two. James stepped into the cabin, taking in the scene. He crouched beside Maggie, his voice calm but firm. "You've done everything you could. Now let them take over." "But," Maggie started, her voice breaking. "They're in good hands," James assured her. "You need to trust us now." As the paramedics worked, Ethan's eyes opened briefly, his gaze landing on Maggie. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips. You came back," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "I promised I would," Maggie replied, kneeling beside him. "You just have to hold on a little longer." Ethan's hand twitched, as if he wanted to reach for hers, but the effort was too much. "Thank you," he whispered, before his eyes closed again. With both Ethan and Linda stabilized, the team prepared to transport them. Maggie watched anxiously as her mother was gently lifted onto a stretcher. Linda's lips moved faintly, her words barely audible over the commotion. "Maggie, stay close." "I'm right here, Mama," Maggie reassured her, clutching her mother's hand, until the paramedics carried her outside. Ethan was next. As they loaded him onto the stretcher, James placed a reassuring hand on Maggie's shoulder. "He'll be okay," he said. "And so will your mother." The helicopter ride back was tense. Maggie sat between her mother and Ethan, her eyes darting between the two, as the medical team monitored their conditions. The hum of the engines filled the silence, a constant reminder of the urgency of their situation. The hospital was a whirlwind of motion. Bright lights, hurried footsteps, and the sterile scent of disinfectant assaulted Maggie's senses as the stretchers were wheeled through the double doors. Nurses and doctors swarmed around them, their voices brisk and professional. Maggie hesitated in the corridor, unsure of where to go. James appeared beside her, his expression kind but serious. "They'll need some time to stabilize them. Come with me. You need to rest." "I can't leave them," Maggie protested, her voice trembling. "You've done more than enough," James said gently. "Now, it's their turn." Reluctantly, Maggie followed him to a waiting area. She sank into one of the chairs, exhaustion finally catching up with her. The weight of the past few days pressed down on her, but she couldn't stop her mind from racing. Hours later, James returned with an update. "Your mother is stable," he said, a small smile breaking through his usual composure. "She's getting the care she needs." Maggie's shoulders sagged with relief. "And Ethan?" "He's recovering," James replied. "He has to see you." Maggie followed him to a private room where Ethan lay propped up against a stack of pillows. His leg was heavily bandaged, and his face was still pale, but his eyes were clearer than before. "Maggie," he said, his voice stronger than it had been earlier. "Come here." She approached cautiously, unsure of what to say. Ethan reached out, his hand trembling slightly. Maggie took it, her small fingers curling around his. "You saved my life," Ethan said, his gaze unwavering. "I won't forget that. And I won't forget your mother either. I'll make sure she gets everything she needs." "You don't have to," Maggie began, but Ethan cut her off. "I do," he insisted. "Because of you, I have a second chance. Let me give you, and your mother, the same." As Maggie left Ethan's room, her mind swirled with emotions. Relief, gratitude, and uncertainty mingled together, leaving her feeling unsteady. She returned to her mother's bedside, where Linda was sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. Maggie sat down, her hand resting gently on her mother's. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The rhythmic beep of heart monitors echoed softly in the sterile hospital room. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting thin stripes across the pale blue walls. Maggie sat in a chair next to her mother's bed, her hands clasped tightly around Linda's frail fingers. It had been 2 days since the rescue, and though exhaustion tugged at her every muscle, Maggie refused to leave her mother's side. Linda stirred slightly, her lips parting, as a soft groan escaped her. Maggie sat up straighter, hope flickering in her chest. "Mama, can you hear me?" Linda's eyes fluttered open, her gaze unfocused at first. Slowly recognition dawned, and she gave Maggie a weak smile. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Of course, Mama," Maggie said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere." Down the hall, Ethan Whitmore lay in his private room, surrounded by the hum of medical equipment. Unlike the modest room Linda occupied, Ethan's suite reflected his wealth: sleek furnishings, fresh flowers on the table, and a large window offering a view of the city skyline. Despite the luxury, Ethan's thoughts were elsewhere. He stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying the events in the forest. Maggie's face, her determination, and her courage lingered in his thoughts. She had saved him when no one else would have dared. A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. "Come in," Ethan called, his voice still hoarse. James entered carrying a folder. "Mr. Whitmore, I've spoken to the doctors. Your recovery is on track, but they recommend several weeks of rest." Ethan nodded absently, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. James hesitated before speaking again. "She's asking about you." Ethan turned his head, his brows furrowing. "Maggie?" "Yes," James replied. "She wanted to know how you're doing. That girl has a heart bigger than most adults I've met." Ethan smiled faintly. "She's remarkable." Later that afternoon, Maggie found herself standing outside Ethan's room. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her shirt as she debated whether to go in. Finally, she knocked softly. "Come in," Ethan's voice called. Maggie stepped inside, her eyes widening slightly at the opulence of the room. Ethan sat up in bed, his leg elevated and wrapped in thick bandages. He looked tired but better. His color had returned, and his eyes were sharper. "Maggie," Ethan greeted, his lips curving into a smile. "It's good to see you." "I just wanted to check on you," Maggie said, shifting nervously. "I wasn't sure if you'd want visitors." "Of course, I do," Ethan said, gesturing to the chair beside his bed. "Come, sit." Maggie sat down, her hands resting in her lap. She glanced at Ethan's leg, her brows knitting together. "Does it still hurt?" Ethan chuckled softly. "It's better now, thanks to you. You saved my life, Maggie. I don't think I can ever repay you for that." "You don't have to repay me," Maggie said quickly, her cheeks flushing. "I just did what anyone would have done." Ethan shook his head. "No, Maggie. What you did was extraordinary. You didn't have to risk your life for a stranger. But you did. That kind of courage. It's rare." Over the next few days, Ethan spent hours reflecting on his life. He shared snippets of his past with Maggie, stories of his rise to success, the sacrifices he had made, and the relationships he had lost along the way. For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to be vulnerable. "When I was younger," Ethan began one evening, staring out the window, "I thought money could solve everything. I worked day and night, building my company, thinking that success would make me happy." "Did it?" Maggie asked softly. Ethan smiled ruefully. "For a while. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what really mattered. My family, my friends, I pushed them all away. And in the end, I was left with nothing but my wealth and my regrets." Maggie listened intently, her heart aching for the man before her. Despite his wealth and power, Ethan was as human as anyone else, flawed, lonely, and searching for redemption. Meanwhile, Linda's health continued to improve. The doctors marveled at her progress, crediting the timely intervention and proper medical care. Maggie spent her days shuttling between her mother's room and Ethan's, her determination never wavering. One afternoon, as Maggie helped Linda sip water, her mother reached out and touched her cheek. "You've grown so much, Maggie," Linda said, her voice filled with pride. "I don't know what I did to deserve a daughter like you." Maggie blinked back tears. "You don't have to deserve it, Mama. You're my family. I'll always take care of you." Linda smiled, her eyes shimmering. "And I'll always be grateful for you." The bond between Maggie and Ethan deepened as they spent more time together. Ethan marveled at Maggie's resilience and resourcefulness, while Maggie found inspiration in Ethan's determination to change his life. He began to see her not just as the girl who saved him, but as someone with untapped potential. One evening, as they sat in the hospital garden, Ethan turned to Maggie. "Have you ever thought about what you want to do in the future?" Maggie hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I've never really had the chance to think about it. My whole life has been about surviving." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're capable of so much more than just surviving, Maggie. When this is all over, I want to help you find your path. Whatever you want to do, I'll make sure you have the tools to do it." As Ethan's recovery progressed, plans were made for Maggie and Linda to relocate to the Whitmore estate. Ethan's promise to provide them with a better life was met with mixed emotions, gratitude, excitement, and a lingering sense of uncertainty. One evening, as Maggie packed her few belongings, Linda sat quietly on the bed. Are you sure about this, Maggie? Linda asked. Leaving the cabin, starting over. It's a big step. Maggie paused, her hands trembling slightly. I don't know what the future holds, Mama, she admitted. But I do know that we deserve a chance to live, not just survive. And Ethan is giving us that chance. Linda nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Then we'll do it. Together. As the sun set over the hospital, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Maggie stood at the window, gazing out at the horizon. For the first time in her life, the future didn't feel like a distant, unattainable dream. It felt real, tangible, and full of promise. But deep in her heart, Maggie knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. They had overcome so much, but the journey was far from over. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the sprawling grounds of the Whitmore estate. Maggie sat quietly in the back seat of a sleek black car, her eyes wide as they approached the towering iron gates. She had never imagined seeing something so grand, let alone living there. Beside her, Linda clutched a small bag of their meager belongings, her expression a mixture of awe and apprehension. As the gates creaked open, revealing a long driveway lined with ancient oaks, Maggie leaned forward, pressing her face against the glass. The mansion came into view, a sprawling structure of white stone, with ivy creeping up its walls, glimmering windows, and elegant columns that seemed to stretch toward the sky. This is unreal, Maggie murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Linda nodded slowly, her grip tightening on the bag. It's like stepping into another world. When the car rolled to a stop in front of the mansion, a tall, impeccably dressed man opened the door for them. Welcome to the Whitmore estate, he said with a polite nod. I'm James, Mr. Whitmore's assistant. Please, follow me. Maggie helped her mother out of the car, steadying her as they climbed the grand stone steps. The front doors opened to reveal a foyer larger than their entire cabin, with marble floors that gleamed under a crystal chandelier. Maggie's breath caught as she took in the sheer scale of the place. Ethan appeared at the top of the staircase, leaning on a cane but smiling warmly. Welcome home, he said, his voice carrying an unexpected tenderness. Maggie felt a lump rise in her throat. Home. The word felt foreign, almost fragile. But as Ethan descended the staircase, his sincerity shone through, easing her doubts. James led them through the mansion, pointing out various rooms and features. The dining hall with its long oak table, the library filled with floor-to-ceiling shelves, and the garden visible through tall glass doors. Maggie couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. The Whitmore estate was a world away from the rustic simplicity of their cabin. Finally, they reached their rooms. James opened the door to a cozy yet elegant suite with soft pastel walls, plush furniture, and a view of the garden. This will be yours, he said, addressing Linda. And Miss Maggie, your room is just down the hall. Maggie peeked inside her own room, her eyes widening at the sight of the soft bed, piled high with pillows, the small writing desk by the window, and the wardrobe stocked with clothes that didn't have holes or patches. Linda sat on the edge of her bed, her hands smoothing over the quilt. This is too much, she said softly, tears pooling in her eyes. Maggie knelt beside her, taking her hand. We've earned this, Mama. After everything we've been through, we deserve something good. The next few days were a whirlwind of adjustment. Maggie and Linda were introduced to the household staff, gardeners, cooks, and housekeepers who ensured the estate ran smoothly. Linda struggled with the idea of being cared for, often insisting on helping where she could. But Ethan gently reminded her that this was her time to rest and heal. Maggie, on the other hand, found herself both fascinated and out of place. She explored the estate with wide-eyed curiosity, marveling at the lush gardens, the grand library, and the stables where sleek horses grazed lazily. One afternoon, she stumbled upon Sam Whitmore, Ethan's teenage nephew, in the garden. Sam was a lanky boy, with a mop of unruly hair and a mischievous grin. "Lost?" he teased, leaning against a tree. "No," Maggie replied, crossing her arms. "Just looking around." "Well, you've found the best spot," Sam said, gesturing to the shaded area beneath the tree. "This is where I come to escape all the formalities." Maggie smiled tentatively. "I can see why." Sam became an unexpected confidant, sharing stories about his life and listening intently to Maggie's tales of the forest. Their friendship blossomed, providing Maggie with a sense of normalcy in an otherwise overwhelming new life. Despite the luxury, Linda grappled with feelings of guilt and inadequacy. She often worried aloud that they didn't belong in such an opulent world. One evening, as she and Ethan sat on the terrace, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she voiced her concerns. "I feel like an intruder," Linda admitted, her voice tinged with sadness. "We've lived so simply for so long. I don't know how to live like this." Ethan rested a hand on hers, his gaze steady. "You're not an intruder, Linda. You're family. This place is as much yours as it is mine." Linda looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know how to thank you." "You've already thanked me," Ethan said softly, "by raising a daughter as brave and selfless as Maggie." As Maggie settled into her new life, she found herself drawn to the stories hidden within the estate. One evening, she wandered into the library and discovered a collection of old photographs and journals. Among them were pictures of Ethan as a young man, smiling alongside people she assumed were his family. James entered quietly, a small smile on his face. "Curious, are we?" Maggie looked up, startled. "I didn't mean to snoop." "You're not snooping," James assured her, pulling out a chair. "These are Ethan's memories. He's been through a lot to get where he is." Maggie hesitated before asking, "Why does he do so much for us?" "He barely knows us." James regarded her for a moment before answering. "Ethan knows what it's like to feel lost, to need help, and have no one to turn to. He sees something in you, Maggie, something he once lost in himself. Hope." As the days passed, Maggie and Linda began to feel more at ease. But beneath the surface, tensions brewed. Charlotte Whitmore, Ethan's estranged sister, returned to the estate, her sharp eyes assessing Maggie and Linda with thinly veiled disdain. During a private conversation with Ethan, Charlotte's words dripped with suspicion. "You barely know them, Ethan. How can you trust them?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Because they've shown me more kindness and loyalty in a few weeks than I've seen from most people in my life." Charlotte smirked, her tone icy. "Just don't let your generosity blind you. Not everyone is what they seem." Maggie overheard the exchange from the hallway, her heart sinking. As much as she wanted to believe they had found a new beginning, a nagging fear lingered in the back of her mind. What if Charlotte was right? What if their presence here disrupted the delicate balance of the Whitmore family? The estate felt different under Charlotte's watchful eyes. Her presence lingered in the hallways, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floors, as if marking her territory. Maggie couldn't help but feel uneasy whenever she passed by Charlotte, whose cold gaze seemed to pierce right through her. For weeks, Maggie and Linda had begun to find their rhythm in their new lives. Maggie excelled in her studies, with the help of private tutors arranged by Ethan. And Linda, now stronger, often volunteered to help the staff with small tasks. The tension that Charlotte brought to the estate, however, was undeniable. Maggie first noticed the change when she overheard hushed conversations between the staff. Words like audit and family business floated through the air, laced with unease. She couldn't shake the feeling that something darker lurked beneath the estate's grandeur. One evening, Maggie found herself in the grand library, flipping through an old book about forestry. The quiet room was her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the weight of her new life. But the peace was shattered when Charlotte entered, her sharp perfume preceding her. "So, this is where you hide," Charlotte said, her voice smooth but cutting. Maggie looked up, her heart skipping a beat. "I wasn't hiding," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Charlotte smirked, leaning against the bookshelf. "You're quite the curiosity, aren't you? Plucked from the woods and dropped into luxury must feel like a fairy tale." Maggie straightened in her chair, meeting Charlotte's gaze. "I'm grateful for everything Mr. Whitmore has done for us." Charlotte's eyes narrowed. "Don't mistake gratitude for entitlement. My brother's generosity has limits." The words stung, but Maggie refused to back down. "I'm not here to take advantage of anyone. I only want what's best for my mother." Charlotte studied her for a long moment before turning away. "Just remember, loyalty doesn't guarantee permanence. People have a way of showing their true colors when they think no one's watching." Maggie watched her leave, the knot in her stomach tightening. For the first time since arriving at the estate, she doubted whether they truly belonged. Later that night, Maggie couldn't sleep. Charlotte's words echoed in her mind, filling her with unease. Driven by curiosity and a nagging sense of foreboding, she wandered the dimly lit hallways of the estate. The moonlight streaming through the tall windows cast eerie shadows along the marble floors. As she passed Ethan's study, she noticed the door slightly ajar. Inside, Ethan sat at his desk, a stack of documents spread before him. His brow was furrowed, and he looked more tired than she'd ever seen. Maggie hesitated before knocking softly. "Mr. Whitmore?" Ethan looked up, startled. "Maggie, what are you doing up?" "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, stepping inside. "Are you okay?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's just business, nothing for you to worry about." But Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. Her eyes drifted to the papers on his desk, catching glimpses of phrases like financial misconduct and legal action. "Is something wrong?" she asked cautiously. Ethan hesitated before shaking his head. "It's just some old issues resurfacing. Nothing I can't handle." Over the next few days, Maggie couldn't stop thinking about the papers she'd seen. Her instincts told her that whatever Ethan was dealing with had something to do with Charlotte. She decided to investigate further. One afternoon, while exploring the mansion's archives, Maggie stumbled upon a locked drawer in a dusty cabinet. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she spent hours searching for the key. When she finally found it hidden behind a row of books, her hands trembled as she turned the lock. Inside were old ledgers, contracts, and handwritten notes. As she sifted through the papers, a chilling realization dawned on her. The Whitmore family's wealth wasn't entirely clean. There were records of shady business deals, exploitative practices, and even ties to companies that harmed local communities. Maggie's heart pounded as she pieced it together. Charlotte had been involved in many of these dealings, and she was likely trying to cover her tracks now that Ethan was pushing for transparency in their business. Unable to keep what she'd found to herself, Maggie approached Ethan in his study. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, clutching the stack of papers she'd taken from the archive. "I think you need to see this." Ethan looked up, his expression turning serious as he noticed the papers in her hands. He gestured for her to sit, and she carefully laid the documents on his desk. As Ethan reviewed the contents, his face grew darker with every page. "Where did you find these?" he asked, his voice low. "In the archives," Maggie admitted. I wasn't trying to snoop, but I had to know. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. This, this explains so much. I knew Charlotte was trying to undermine me, but I didn't realize the extent of her involvement. Maggie hesitated before asking, "What are you going to do?" Ethan's eyes met hers, a fire igniting in their depths. "I'm going to put an end to this. No more secrets, no more corruption." That evening, Ethan called for a family meeting. Maggie sat silently in the corner of the room, her presence a silent support for Ethan. Charlotte arrived last, her expression cool and composed. "What's this about, Ethan?" she asked, taking a seat. Ethan placed the incriminating documents on the table. "This is about accountability. It's about our family's legacy." Charlotte's eyes flicked to the papers, her composure faltering for the first time. "Where did you get those?" "That doesn't matter," Ethan replied firmly. "What matters is that we face the truth and make things right." The tension in the room was palpable as Ethan laid out his plans to address the family's unethical practices. Charlotte's protests were loud and angry, but Ethan's resolve was unshakable. As the meeting ended, Maggie felt a strange mix of relief and unease. Ethan's determination to do the right thing was inspiring, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. That night, as she stood by the window of her room, staring out at the moonlit gardens, she made a silent promise to herself. She would do whatever it took to protect Ethan, Linda, and the life they had built together. But deep down, she knew the shadows from the past wouldn't fade so easily. The morning dawned with an unsettling stillness over the Whitmore estate. Ethan stood in his office, staring at the documents spread across his desk. The air was thick with the weight of decisions he could no longer avoid. The time had come to confront not only his family, but the corrupt foundation upon which their fortune had been built. Maggie entered quietly, her presence a steadying force in the chaotic whirlwind of Ethan's thoughts. She carried a tray of coffee, placing it gently on the edge of his desk. "You've been up all night again," she said softly, her eyes filled with concern. Ethan smiled faintly. "It's hard to sleep when the weight of the world feels like it's pressing down on you." Maggie hesitated before speaking. "You don't have to carry it alone. We're here to help." Ethan reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've already done more than I could ever ask for, Maggie. But today, I need to face this head on." By mid-morning, the Whitmore family boardroom buzzed with an uneasy energy. Executives and shareholders filled the long table, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to palpable tension. At the head of the table sat Charlotte, her sharp gaze scanning the room like a predator sizing up its prey. Ethan entered the room with a calm determination. Maggie and Linda stood discreetly at the back, their presence a quiet reminder of the moral compass that had guided Ethan to this moment. "Let's begin," Charlotte said, her voice crisp. "What's this all about, Ethan?" Ethan placed a thick folder on the table. "This is about transparency, accountability, and the future of this company." Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "Spare us the theatrics. Get to the point." Ethan opened the folder, revealing detailed records of the family's unethical practices, documents that Maggie had discovered. Gasps rippled through the room as the executives leaned in to examine the evidence. "These records," Ethan began, his voice steady, "detail years of financial misconduct, exploitation, and underhanded deals. They represent everything I've spent my life trying to distance myself from." Charlotte's lips curled into a smirk. "And what exactly do you plan to do with this, dear brother? Burn the company to the ground?" Ethan met her gaze without flinching. "Number it, I plan to rebuild it from the ground up, This company will no longer be a symbol of greed and corruption. It will be a force for good. The room erupted into chaos. Some executives voiced their support. Others questioned Ethan's authority, and a few accused him of jeopardizing their profits. Through it all, Ethan stood firm, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "This isn't just about money," he said. "It's about doing what's right. We have a chance to make amends, to use our resources to create something meaningful." Charlotte slammed her hand on the table. "And what happens to the rest of us while you play savior? Do you expect us to sacrifice everything for your guilt trip?" Ethan's expression hardened. "This isn't about sacrifice, Charlotte. It's about integrity. Something you've conveniently ignored for far too long." As the debate grew more heated, Linda stepped forward. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of a lifetime of resilience. "May I speak?" she asked, drawing the room's attention. Ethan nodded, offering her the floor. Linda took a deep breath. "I've seen firsthand what it means to struggle, to fight for survival every single day. This company has the power to change lives, to lift people out of the darkness instead of pushing them deeper into it. You have a responsibility, no, an obligation, to use that power wisely." Her words hung in the air, a stark contrast to the corporate jargon that usually filled the boardroom. Even Charlotte seemed momentarily taken aback. "Thank you, Linda," Ethan said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You've reminded us all of what truly matters." The meeting ended with a divided vote. Ethan's proposal for transparency and reform narrowly passed, much to Charlotte's dismay. She stormed out of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Maggie approached Ethan, her expression a mix of relief and concern. "Do you think it'll be enough?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's a start, but change doesn't happen overnight. It'll take time, effort, and sacrifice." Maggie nodded. "You're doing the right thing. That's what matters." Ethan smiled faintly. "Thanks to you, Maggie. You've been my compass through all of this." That evening, Ethan gathered Maggie, Linda, and the estate staff in the garden. Under the soft glow of lanterns, he addressed the group. "Today marks the beginning of a new chapter for this family and this company," he said. "But it's also a reminder of where we've come from and the values we choose to uphold." With Maggie's help, Ethan planted a young tree in the center of the garden. Its delicate branches swayed gently in the breeze, a symbol of hope and renewal. "This tree," Ethan said, "represents growth, resilience, and the promise of a brighter future. It's a reminder that even in the face of adversity, we have the power to grow stronger." As the group dispersed, Maggie lingered by the tree, her fingers brushing against its leaves. She felt a deep sense of pride in what they had accomplished, but a nagging worry tugged at the edges of her mind. From the shadows, a figure watched the scene unfold. Their presence went unnoticed, but their intentions were clear. The battle for justice was far from over, and darker challenges lay ahead. The soft hum of a car engine faded as Maggie stepped out, her worn boots touching the pavement of the prestigious Redwood Academy. The towering brick walls and ivy-covered arches of the campus loomed ahead, starkly different from the dense forest she once called home. Students milled about in tailored uniforms, their laughter and conversations a foreign symphony to her ears. Maggie clutched her leather satchel tightly, her heart pounding. It was Ethan's idea to enroll her in one of the most esteemed schools in the state. Despite her initial protests, he had insisted. "You belong here, Maggie," he'd said. "You've earned this chance." The first few weeks at Redwood Academy were an uphill battle. Maggie was acutely aware of her differences. While other students talked about summer vacations abroad and lavish parties, she found herself struggling to grasp concepts in advanced mathematics and literature. Her teachers, though kind, often looked at her with a mix of pity and skepticism. "You've got potential," one had remarked, "but you'll need to work twice as hard to catch up." Determined, Maggie threw herself into her studies. Nights once spent foraging in the woods were now devoted to textbooks and essays. She frequented the library, where the head librarian, Mrs. Kensington, took notice of her determination. "You remind me of myself at your age," Mrs. Kensington said one evening, sliding a particularly dense biology book across the counter. "Keep at it, and you'll surprise everyone, including yourself." Amidst the challenges, one constant source of encouragement was Sam Whitmore, Ethan's nephew. Though he came from the same privileged background as the other students, Sam had a down-to-earth demeanor that set him apart. "You're doing great, Maggie," Sam said one afternoon, as they sat under a sprawling oak tree on campus. "Don't let them intimidate you." "It's not that simple," Maggie replied, her voice tinged with frustration. "I don't belong here, Sam. They all see me as the girl from the woods." Sam leaned back against the tree trunk, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Maybe you don't belong in their world, but that doesn't mean you can't carve out your own space." His words stuck with her. Slowly but surely, Maggie began to find her footing. Over time, Maggie's perseverance started to pay off. Her grades improved, and her teachers took notice of her sharp insights and unique perspective. In English class, she earned praise for an essay about survival and resilience, drawing from her experiences in the forest. "You have a voice, Maggie," her teacher said, handing back the graded paper with a proud smile. "Use it." Her newfound confidence extended beyond academics. Maggie joined the school's environmental club, where her knowledge of plants and ecosystems impressed even the most seasoned members. "We could use someone like you," said Jordan, the club president. "You've got real-world experience, and that's something none of us can compete with." One crisp autumn afternoon, Ethan and Linda visited Maggie on campus. Linda, now healthier and more vibrant, marveled at the grandeur of the academy. "You've come so far, my girl," Linda said, her voice filled with pride. "Your father would have been over the moon to see this." Maggie smiled, her chest swelling with emotion. She gave Ethan a grateful look. "None of this would have been possible without you." Ethan shook his head. "You've always had the strength, Maggie. All I did was open the door. You walked through it." Not everyone at Redwood Academy welcomed Maggie's success. A group of affluent students, led by Charlotte's teenage daughter Olivia, often whispered behind her back or made snide remarks in class. "Who does she think she is?" Olivia sneered one day. "Just because Uncle Ethan decided to play savior doesn't mean she belongs here." Maggie overheard the comment, but chose not to react. Instead, she focused on proving them wrong through her actions. Her patience was tested when Olivia sabotaged one of Maggie's environmental projects, scattering her carefully prepared materials across the quad. Furious but composed, Maggie confronted Olivia. "You can try to tear me down," Maggie said firmly, "but I'm not going anywhere." By the end of the school year, Maggie had transformed. She was no longer the shy, uncertain girl who had stepped onto campus months earlier. She stood tall as one of the top-performing students, earning recognition at the annual awards ceremony. When her name was called for the Environmental Impact Award, Maggie walked to the stage amidst thunderous applause. As she accepted the plaque, she spoke from the heart. "This award isn't just mine," she said, her voice steady. "It belongs to everyone who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. To Ethan Whitmore, who saw my potential. To my mother, who taught me resilience. And to the forest, which shaped the person I am today." Ethan's influence extended beyond Maggie's education. Inspired by her story, he launched a new community center dedicated to supporting underprivileged youth. The center offered educational programs, mentorship opportunities, and resources for families in need. Maggie often volunteered at the center, sharing her experiences and encouraging others to dream big. "You're living proof that anyone can rise above their circumstances," one young girl said to Maggie during a workshop. Maggie smiled. "And so can you. Never let anyone tell you what you can or can't achieve." As Maggie prepared for her second year at Redwood Academy, a letter arrived addressed to Ethan. Its contents hinted at unresolved conflicts within the Whitmore family and a potential threat to the community center's success. Ethan read the letter with a furrowed brow, then turned to Maggie. "We've come so far, but it seems the fight isn't over yet." Maggie's heart sank, but she met Ethan's gaze with determination. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." The golden rays of the morning sun filtered through the wide windows of the Whitmore estate, but the warmth of the day seemed absent inside the grand dining hall. Ethan sat at the head of the table, his usually calm demeanor overshadowed by a furrowed brow and tight lips. Spread before him were several documents, each marked with bold red stamps reading "Confidential." Across from him, Maggie sat silently, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the edge of her notebook. The letter they had received a week ago had been the catalyst for an investigation that Ethan hoped would be straightforward. However, what they uncovered was anything but simple. Maggie, now attuned to the complexities of the Whitmore family's dynamics, knew that any disturbance in their already fragile unity could be disastrous. The first indication of trouble came when James Lawson, Ethan's loyal assistant, approached him with a grave expression. "We've confirmed the source of the leak," James said, placing a sealed envelope on the table. "You're not going to like this." Ethan opened the envelope slowly, his hands steady despite the tension in the air. Inside were photographs and detailed reports showing deliberate attempts to discredit his philanthropic efforts. The worst part? The orchestrator was someone close to home. "It's Charlotte," James admitted reluctantly. "She's been working with an external PR firm to sabotage your reputation. These leaks about mismanagement at the community center, they're all part of her plan." Maggie's breath caught. Why would she do that? Doesn't she care about the people being helped? Ethan's jaw tightened. "Charlotte cares about control, Maggie, and she's never been one to tolerate what she sees as a threat to the family's image." Meanwhile, Charlotte sat in her office, her sharp eyes scanning the latest headlines on her tablet. "Whitmore Center faces allegations of fraud," one headline read. Another declared, "Ethan Whitmore, savior or opportunist." A smirk played on her lips as she sipped her morning coffee. "He's always been the sentimental one," she murmured, her voice dripping with disdain. "But this time, sentimentality won't win." Her assistant, a nervous young man named Victor, hesitated before speaking. "Ma'am, are you sure this is the right course of action? If Mr. Whitmore finds out—" "He won't," Charlotte interrupted coldly. "And even if he does, it'll be too late. The damage will already be done." That afternoon, Maggie decided to dig deeper. Something about the way the accusations were phrased didn't sit right with her. Borrowing one of Ethan's laptops, she began combing through files, cross-referencing reports, and searching for patterns. Hours passed, and just as her eyes began to blur from exhaustion, she found it: a series of emails between Charlotte and a high-profile PR firm. The emails outlined a calculated smear campaign, complete with fabricated evidence meant to undermine Ethan's credibility. Her heart sank as she read the words. Why would someone go to such lengths to destroy their own family? She whispered to herself. Before she could process further, the door creaked open. Ethan stood in the doorway, his face a mixture of curiosity and concern. Maggie, what are you doing? She turned the screen toward him. I think I've found something you need to see. The following evening, Ethan confronted Charlotte during a family dinner. The once warm dining hall now felt like a battlefield. You've been working against me, Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. Leaking false information, hiring PR firms to smear my name. Why, Charlotte? Charlotte didn't deny it. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her icy gaze fixed on her brother. You've always been naive, Ethan. Throwing money at problems doesn't solve them. It's bad enough you're wasting the family's resources on these projects, but now you're dragging the Whitmore name through the mud. I'm helping people, Ethan shot back, his voice rising. People who need it. You're the one tarnishing our name with your deceit. The tension in the room was palpable. Maggie, seated beside Linda, clenched her fists under the table. She wanted to speak up, to defend Ethan, but she knew this was a fight he needed to handle. Charlotte's expression didn't waver. You think your little charity projects make you a hero. They're a liability, Ethan, and liabilities get dealt with. While Ethan grappled with the emotional fallout, Maggie knew they needed proof to clear his name and expose Charlotte's true motives. She enlisted the help of Sam, who had access to areas of the estate that she didn't. Late one night, they snuck into Charlotte's private study. The room was immaculate, with a faint scent of lavender and a desk that gleamed under the moonlight. Maggie's heart raced as she rifled through drawers, her fingers searching for anything that could serve as evidence. Here, Sam whispered, holding up a folder labeled Whitmore Initiatives. Inside were documents that revealed not only Charlotte's plans to discredit Ethan, but also her attempts to embezzle funds from the family business. Maggie snapped photos of everything with her phone. We've got her, she said, her voice trembling with both fear and triumph. Armed with the evidence, Ethan held a press conference to address the allegations. Maggie watched nervously from the sidelines as he spoke with conviction. These accusations against the Whitmore Center are false, Ethan declared. And today, I'm presenting proof of where they came from. He displayed the documents Maggie and Sam had uncovered, publicly exposing Charlotte's betrayal. The room buzzed with whispers and camera flashes as the truth came to light. Charlotte, watching from the estate, felt her carefully constructed world crumble. For the first time, she realized the extent of the damage she had caused, not just to Ethan, but to herself. In the days that followed, Ethan and Maggie worked tirelessly to rebuild the center's reputation. Donations poured in from supporters who admired Ethan's resilience and honesty. One evening, as they sat together in the estate's library, Ethan turned to Maggie. You saved me again, he said, a wry smile on his face. Maggie shrugged. It's what family does, right? Ethan's expression softened. You're right, and you're as much a part of this family as anyone else. Though the immediate crisis had been resolved, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that Charlotte's betrayal was only the beginning. One day, while helping Linda in the garden, she overheard James discussing something with Ethan in hushed tones. What do you mean there's more? Ethan asked, his voice tense. Maggie's heart sank. Whatever lay ahead, she knew their journey was far from over. The Whitmore estate, though vast and imposing, felt warmer than ever, as the late afternoon sun bathed its sprawling gardens in golden hues. Inside the grand drawing room, Ethan sat at the head of a modest gathering. The tension from Charlotte's betrayal had yet to fully dissipate, but there was a new resolve in the air, a determination to rebuild not just their reputation, but their family bonds. Maggie sat beside Ethan, her notebook open on her lap, as she scribbled down thoughts and ideas. Linda, her health steadily improving, observed her daughter with pride, a faint smile softening her features. On the opposite end of the room, Sam leaned against the fireplace mantel, his arms crossed, listening intently as Ethan outlined the next steps. We've cleared our name, but the damage to the foundation and the community center is still fresh. Ethan began, his tone steady yet resolute. Rebuilding trust will take more than words. Maggie glanced up from her notebook. Actions speak louder than words, she said softly. We need to show the community that we're still here for them. Ethan nodded, his gaze sweeping across the room. Exactly. And that starts with transparency. From now on, every donation, every project, every expense will be public knowledge. Linda, her voice still gentle from her recovery, added, and it wouldn't hurt to be present. If people see you working alongside them, they'll understand that this isn't just a vanity project. Ethan's smile widened. I couldn't agree more. The meeting was interrupted by a hesitant knock at the door. James entered, his usually calm demeanor tinged with unease. Mr. Whitmore, Miss Charlotte is here to see you. The room fell silent. Maggie's heart skipped a beat, and Sam's expression darkened. Linda reached for Maggie's hand, squeezing it gently. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Show her in. Charlotte stepped into the room, her sharp features softened by what appeared to be genuine remorse. Her usual icy confidence was replaced with uncertainty as she took a few cautious steps forward. Ethan, she began, her voice quieter than usual. I came to apologize. Ethan raised an eyebrow, his skepticism clear. Apologize? For what exactly, Charlotte? Trying to destroy everything I've worked for. Undermining the family name. Charlotte flinched but held her ground. I know I made mistakes, grave ones, but I believed I was protecting the family. I see now that I was wrong. Maggie's gaze darted between them. While she doubted Charlotte's sincerity, something in her tone suggested she wasn't entirely insincere. Ethan leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. Do you have any idea what your actions have cost us? The community's trust, our reputation, and nearly my life's work. Charlotte's voice broke as she replied, I know, Ethan, and I want to make it right. Please, give me the chance to fix this. The room buzzed with silent tension as Ethan considered her words. Finally, he turned to Maggie. What do you think? Maggie froze. The weight of Ethan's trust in her judgment was overwhelming. She glanced at Linda, who gave her an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, Maggie said, if she truly wants to make amends, then let her. But trust needs to be earned. She should work with the people she's wronged to understand the damage she's caused. Ethan studied Maggie's face, then nodded. All right, Charlotte. You'll start at the community center. Volunteer work, under the supervision of the board. If you're serious about making things right, this is where you'll prove it. Charlotte's expression wavered between relief and apprehension. Thank you, Ethan. I won't let you down. In the weeks that followed, the Whitmore family worked tirelessly to rebuild. Ethan and Maggie often visited the community center, working alongside volunteers to repair broken facilities and restore programs. Linda, though still recovering, organized fundraisers from the estate, using her warmth and grace to win over donors. Maggie found herself drawn to the children at the center, helping them with schoolwork and listening to their stories. One afternoon, a young boy named Toby approached her, clutching a tattered book. Miss Maggie, can you read this to me? He asked shyly. Maggie knelt beside him, taking the book in her hands. Of course, Toby. As she read aloud, the boy's eyes lit up, and for the first time, Maggie felt the profound impact of their efforts. These were the lives they were changing, the futures they were shaping. Charlotte's initial reluctance to work at the community center gradually gave way to genuine engagement. Though many were wary of her presence, she began to earn their respect through her actions. She organized food drives, facilitated workshops, and even spent time cleaning the grounds. Maggie watched from a distance one day as Charlotte helped an elderly woman carry boxes of supplies. Turning to Ethan, she said, "Do you think she's really changed?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Time will tell, but at least she's trying." As the holidays approached, Ethan decided to host a community dinner at the estate, a gesture of goodwill and unity. The grand dining hall was transformed into a festive space, filled with laughter, music, and the aroma of delicious food. Maggie stood by the fireplace, watching as Ethan spoke with a group of volunteers. Linda approached her, a look of pride in her eyes. "You've come so far, Maggie," she said, her voice tinged with emotion. "You've made a difference." Maggie smiled, leaning into her mother's embrace. "We'll all have, Mama." Toward the end of the evening, Ethan called for everyone's attention. Standing beside him were Maggie, Linda, and even Charlotte. "This family has faced its share of trials," he began, his voice steady. "But through it all, we've found strength in each other. And that strength has allowed us to help others." He turned to Maggie, his expression softening. "Maggie, your courage and compassion have been the heart of this journey. You've shown us what it means to truly care for others." The room erupted in applause as Maggie's cheeks flushed with pride. As the evening wound down, Maggie found herself alone in the garden, gazing up at the star-filled sky. She thought of how far they had come and the challenges they had overcome. But her thoughts were interrupted by Ethan's voice. "Maggie, there's something we need to discuss." She turned to see him standing in the doorway, a serious look on his face. "What is it?" she asked. Ethan hesitated, then said, "There's been another development, something that might threaten everything we've built." Maggie's heart sank, but she nodded. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." The morning light cast long shadows across the vast Whitmore estate, highlighting the dew-kissed grass and the freshly blooming garden beds. Ethan stood at the edge of the lawn, his cane firmly planted in the earth, as he surveyed the tree they had planted months earlier. Its branches stretched upward, its leaves vibrant and full, a living symbol of growth and resilience. Maggie approached quietly, a small notebook tucked under her arm. She had been spending more time in the garden lately, finding solace among the flowers and trees. As she reached Ethan's side, she followed his gaze to the flourishing tree. "It's grown so much," she remarked, her voice soft with wonder. Ethan smiled faintly. "Just like you, Maggie." Maggie glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I had good soil," she said, mimicking the metaphor Ethan often used. "And a lot of sunlight." Ethan chuckled. "You had more than that. You had grit, determination, and a heart that refuses to give up." As the day progressed, the estate became a hive of activity. Trucks rolled in, carrying supplies for the new Whitmore Foundation headquarters, a sprawling building Ethan had envisioned as a center for change. It would house classrooms, community meeting spaces, and a library filled with resources for underprivileged families. Linda stood on the front steps, overseeing the arrival of materials. Though her frame remained delicate, her presence was commanding. She had found new purpose in managing the foundation's initiatives, often offering quiet words of encouragement to the workers and staff. "Looks like you've got everything under control," Maggie said, as she joined her mother. Linda turned, her eyes warm. "I learned from the best," she replied, giving her daughter a knowing look. Maggie laughed, shaking her head. You've always been the best, Mama. Their moment was interrupted by Sam, who approached with a clipboard in hand. Maggie, we need your input on the children's center layout, he said, his tone businesslike, but friendly. Maggie nodded, following him inside. The building was still a skeleton of beams and scaffolding, but she could already picture the vibrant life it would hold. She spent the next hour sketching ideas with Sam, her passion shining through, as she discussed ways to make the space welcoming and functional. Later that evening, Maggie sat with Ethan in his study. The room was lined with shelves filled with books and artifacts, each telling a story of the Whitmore family's history. Ethan handed her a leather-bound journal, its edges worn with age. This belonged to my grandfather, he explained. He started this family's fortune with nothing but a dream and a willingness to take risks. Maggie ran her fingers over the cover. It's incredible, she said, her voice filled with reverence. Ethan leaned back in his chair. It is, but it's also a reminder that no legacy is perfect. My family's wealth came with sacrifices, some noble, others not. Maggie frowned. Like the business dealings Charlotte tried to hide? Ethan nodded solemnly. Yes, and I've made it my mission to undo as much harm as I can. That's what the foundation is about, turning privilege into progress. Maggie met his gaze, her determination matching his. We'll make sure it does. A few weeks later, the Whitmore Foundation hosted its grand opening ceremony. The estate's grounds were transformed into a festival-like atmosphere, with music, food, and activities for families. Maggie stood on the stage, clutching her speech nervously as she glanced at the growing crowd. You've got this, Sam whispered, giving her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. As she stepped up to the microphone, the murmurs quieted. Maggie took a deep breath, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. When I first arrived at this estate, I felt like an outsider, she began. I didn't think I belonged in a place so grand, surrounded by people so accomplished. But I've learned that belonging isn't about where you come from. It's about what you stand for. The crowd listened intently as Maggie shared her story, weaving in the challenges she and her mother had faced, and how Ethan's kindness had changed their lives. She spoke of the foundation's mission to provide opportunities for those in need, ensuring that no one would feel as lost or hopeless as she once had. We're planting seeds, she concluded, gesturing toward the symbolic tree in the distance. Seeds of hope, growth, and unity. And with time, those seeds will grow into something beautiful. The audience erupted into applause as Maggie stepped back, her cheeks flushed with pride. After the ceremony, Ethan led a small group to the garden, where the tree now stood tall and proud. Among the group were Maggie, Linda, Sam, and a handful of community leaders who had supported the foundation's vision. Ethan held a small plaque in his hands, engraved with the words, "In honor of those who dare to believe in a better tomorrow." Would you do the honors? He asked Maggie. Maggie nodded, taking the plaque and carefully placing it at the base of the tree. As she stood back, a sense of peace washed over her. The tree wasn't just a symbol of their journey. It was a promise to future generations. That evening, Maggie sat by the fireplace with her mother and Ethan. The room was quiet, save for the soft crackle of the flames. Maggie, Ethan said, breaking the silence, you've done so much already. But I have a feeling your journey is just beginning. Maggie tilted her head, curious. What do you mean? Ethan smiled. I think you're destined to do great things, far beyond this estate. And when you do, remember this. A legacy isn't just about what you leave behind. It's about the lives you touch along the way. Linda placed a hand on Maggie's shoulder. He's right, sweetheart. You've already touched so many lives. Maggie looked between them, her heart swelling with gratitude. I couldn't have done any of this without you? Ethan chuckled. Maybe not. But the courage, the compassion, that was all you. As the night wore on, Maggie found herself standing in the garden, staring up at the stars. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers. She thought of the tree, of the foundation, and of all the people who had believed in her. For the first time in her life, the future didn't seem like an uphill battle. It felt like an open road, filled with endless possibilities. The sun cast a golden glow across the expansive Whitmore estate as Maggie stood on the balcony outside her new room, gazing at the garden below. The tree they had planted now stood tall and proud, its leaves rustling gently in the early morning breeze. It was a symbol of hope, a reminder of how far they had come and how much further they could go. Maggie's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at her door. She turned to see Linda stepping inside, her expression a mix of pride and excitement. Maggie, Linda began, her voice warm. Ethan is waiting for you in the study. He has something he wants to share. Maggie nodded, setting aside her journal and smoothing her dress. She followed her mother down the grand staircase, her footsteps echoing softly against the polished wood. The house felt alive this morning, buzzing with quiet energy, as the staff moved efficiently through its halls. As they entered the study, Ethan stood by the window, a folder in his hands. He turned and smiled when he saw them, gesturing for Maggie to sit. Maggie, Ethan began, his voice steady and filled with emotion. You've been an inspiration to me, to all of us. You've shown courage, resilience, and kindness in ways I never thought possible. Today I want to give you something to help you take the next step. He handed her the folder, watching as she carefully opened it. Maggie's eyes widened as she saw the letterhead of one of the country's most prestigious universities. The words on the page blurred as tears filled her eyes. Is this, she began, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded. A full scholarship. Everything is covered. Tuition, housing, books. I've also set up a trust fund to ensure you never have to worry about finances while you pursue your dreams. Maggie's hands shook as she clutched the papers. Ethan, I don't know what to say. Linda placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, her eyes shimmering with tears. Say yes, sweetheart. This is your chance to build a life beyond anything we ever imagined. Maggie looked at Ethan, her voice firm, despite the lump in her throat. I won't waste this opportunity. I'll make you proud. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparations. Maggie packed her belongings, attended farewell dinners, and spent long evenings in the garden with Linda and Ethan. The thought of leaving the estate filled her with both excitement and apprehension. On her final night at the estate, Maggie sat beneath the legacy tree, her journal open on her lap. She wrote about her hopes, her fears, and the promise she had made to herself, to use this opportunity to help others, just as Ethan had helped her. Ethan joined her, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. He handed one to her and settled on the bench beside her. Nervous? He asked. Maggie nodded, staring up at the tree. A little, but mostly excited. It's just hard to leave. Ethan smiled. You're not leaving, Maggie. This will always be your home. And no matter where you go, we'll be here, cheering you on. She turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. You've always had it in you, Maggie. I just gave you the tools to see it. The morning of Maggie's departure was bittersweet. Linda hugged her tightly at the train station, whispering words of encouragement as tears streamed down her face. Be brave, my girl, Linda said, her voice trembling. And remember, no matter how far you go, I'm always with you. Maggie held her mother close, her heart aching. I'll make you proud, Mama. I promise. Ethan stepped forward, placing a hand on Maggie's shoulder. Go out there and change the world, Maggie. I know you will. As the train pulled away, Maggie waved to them through the window, her heart filled with a mix of sadness and hope. She watched as the estate disappeared into the distance, replaced by rolling hills and open fields. For the first time in her life, the world felt wide open, a canvas waiting for her to leave her mark. Maggie's arrival at the university was overwhelming at first. The campus was bustling with students from all walks of life, each pursuing their own dreams. Maggie found herself drawn to the community center, where she began volunteering with underprivileged youth, sharing her story and inspiring them to overcome their challenges. She excelled in her classes, her natural curiosity and determination setting her apart. Professors took notice of her drive, and she quickly became a mentor to her peers. Back at the estate, Ethan and Linda kept in touch through letters and phone calls. They followed Maggie's journey with pride, celebrating her accomplishments from afar. 4 years later, Maggie stood on a stage once again, this time at her graduation ceremony. She delivered a heartfelt speech, thanking those who had supported her and sharing her vision for the future. I was once a girl in the forest, with nothing but hope and determination, she said. Today, I stand here because someone believed in me. And now, it's my turn to believe in others. The audience erupted into applause as Maggie stepped down, her heart swelling with pride. Maggie returned to the estate that summer, her degree in hand and a new sense of purpose in her heart. She embraced Linda tightly, the two of them laughing and crying as they reunited. Ethan met her by the legacy tree, his smile broad and filled with pride. Welcome home, Maggie. She grinned, holding up her diploma. I couldn't have done it without you. Ethan shook his head. You did this, Maggie. You earned every bit of it. As the sun set over the estate, Maggie shared her plans with Ethan and Linda. She wanted to expand the foundation, creating programs for young girls in underserved communities. Her dream was to give them the same chance she had been given, to inspire them to dream big and work hard. Ethan nodded, his eyes misty with emotion. Let's do it. Together, they planted another tree beside the first, a symbol of growth, hope, and the promise of a brighter future. What would you have done in Maggie's shoes? Would you have found the courage to help a stranger in need, risking everything for a chance at something better? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if Maggie's journey inspired you, imagine how many more untold stories are out there waiting to be shared. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter of resilience, hope, and the power of kindness. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. We'll see you in the next story.